In this village, the important things are never announced properly. They happen in the margins, between prayers and laughter, under flickering candles, among snoring bodies and half-remembered dreams. There are no grand heroes here, no prophecies carved in stone, only ordinary people, animals with far too much personality, and nights that tell the truth more honestly than daylight ever does. This is a story about a place held together by noise, habit, and the small, strange moments that feel almost sacred by accident. Morning in that village did not announce itself with clarity or purpose. It crept in sideways, dragging damp air and unfinished thoughts along with it. Doors were opened, not because anyone felt ready, but because habit had sharper teeth than sleep. Somewhere behind a shutter, a man sat on the edge of his bed arguing with his boots, convinced they had shrunk overnight out of spite. He would lose the argument and wear them anyway. The street began to fill with small, unimportant sounds that together formed the village's true alarm. Wood shifted, fabric sighed, a bucket was dropped, then retrieved with an apology spoken directly to the ground. Someone coughed in a way that suggested it was more social than medical. The mud accepted every footstep without judgment, holding on to ankles like it feared abandonment. Near the well, the two women remained exactly where they had been, as if they had never left the bench at all. They watched the world reassemble itself with the patience of people who believed very little would improve. One tugged her shawl tighter and announced, to no one in particular, that mornings like this were dangerous. The other nodded gravely, because danger was easier to accept than optimism. Between them, the bucket creaked, aware that it would soon be expected to perform despite its age. The boy with the fish slowed his steps as he reached the shadow of the church. The building loomed in the way only old stone could, heavy with memory and slightly judgmental. He glanced into the bucket again. The fish did not blink. It simply stared back with the cold authority of something that knew its fate involved either a plate or a pardon. The boy sighed. He adjusted his grip. Hunger was persuasive, but fear of the reeve was more so, especially before breakfast. From the tavern doorway came a groan as another patron emerged, this one clinging to the frame as though the building might drift away without him. He squinted at the light, offended by its existence, and muttered something about vows he no longer remembered making. The chicken under his arm shifted, unimpressed by the entire arrangement. When he staggered off, the door swung shut behind him, sealing in the lingering scent of old ale and regret. Above it all, the rooster remained still, surveying the chaos with a calm that bordered on philosophical. He had seen this morning before. He would see it again. His decision to delay his duties was not laziness, but commentary. Below him, life continued regardless of his silence, which only confirmed his suspicion that he was underappreciated. The blacksmith's shed shuddered as the forge caught properly, its breath turning from a hiss into a low growl. Heat bloomed slowly, like irritation finding its voice. Soon the hammer would follow, striking iron with a rhythm that suggested both craftsmanship and personal grievance. For now, though, the smith stood wiping his hands, staring into the fire as if daring it to misbehave. Across the lane, a door opened to release a woman carrying a basket of laundry already heavier than her patience. She froze when she saw Gertrude's flank disappearing behind a hanging sheet. There was a pause, the kind that weighed options. Then she turned back inside. Some battles were not worth fighting before the sun had fully committed. Children began to appear, blinking and uncoordinated, trailing behind instructions they had no intention of following. One was sent to fetch water and returned with mud on his knees and a story about a dog that may or may not have spoken to him. No one questioned it. Truth was flexible at that hour. Time stretched, unbothered by productivity. The village lingered in its half-awake state, suspended between intention and inevitability. Nothing important had happened yet, and somehow everything had. It was the kind of morning that did not move forward so much as slowly gather itself, waiting for someone, anyone, to give it a reason to become a day. Once the village finally conceded that sleep had lost its argument, everything moved at once, clumsy and determined. The first steps of the day landed heavily, boots thudding into mud that had already memorized every heel in town. Belts were fastened too tight, then loosened again with a grunt. Sleeves were rolled with the optimism of people who believed the work might end early, despite all evidence to the contrary. Noise thickened. Not conversation, not yet, but the friction of objects being put to use. Doors slammed and were immediately apologized to. A ladder fell over, was set upright again, and then fell a second time out of spite. Somewhere near the smithy, a curse repeated itself with such consistency it bordered on music. A rhythm emerged. Hammer, breath, complaint, repeat. Authority made its usual appearance in fragments. Someone shouted instructions no one claimed responsibility for later. A bell's echo faded into the air, unanswered but obeyed anyway. Ritual did not require understanding. It required participation. And participation, however sloppy, had begun. Inside the crooked cottage, breakfast took on its familiar role as both sustenance and test of character. The pot was stirred not to improve its contents, but to prevent rebellion. Steam lifted sluggishly, carrying with it a smell that settled into the walls like an accusation. The woman at the hearth adjusted her stance, weight shifting from one foot to the other, her patience thinning with every slow bubble. She did not taste the food. She never did. Experience had taught her it would not change. Her husband swallowed another mouthful, jaw working carefully as if each bite needed approval before being allowed passage. He stared at the table, counting chew by chew, measuring effort against reward. When he finally nodded, it was not satisfaction. It was acceptance. This was fuel. It would have to do. Next door, the girl finished pouring and wiped the rim of the cup with her thumb. Her grandfather drank deeply, eyes closing in gratitude to whatever gods governed fermented hope. He smacked his lips, declared his stomach settled, and immediately asked for more. She glanced at the jug, considered lying, and chose silence instead. Silence, she had learned, lasted longer. Across the lane, water splashed with unnecessary violence as faces were assaulted into wakefulness. Someone gasped, someone laughed, someone cursed the cold as if it had arrived personally to cause offense. A borrowed tunic served briefly as a towel, then as a handkerchief, then was returned to a peg without comment. Ownership was flexible before breakfast. In another doorway, a woman attacked her own armpits with determination and plant matter, muttering under her breath. The words shifted between reverence and resentment, impossible to separate. Hygiene, like faith, was practiced according to mood and opportunity. Teeth were addressed with whatever tools felt convincing. Fingers, twigs, powders, whose original purpose had been forgotten. One experiment involving dairy ended a conversation mid-sentence and was not repeated. In the corner of a low-ceilinged room, a child stood before a cracked mirror, tongue pressed in concentration. His hair resisted all attempts at order. He slapped it once, twice, as if discipline alone might bring it into alignment. It did not. He frowned, tried again, then abandoned the effort entirely, declaring it good enough and leaving with curls pointing in several directions of equal confidence. Outside, the chorus of hearths grew louder. Wood caught properly now, flames gaining confidence. Iron rang against iron. Somewhere a pan was dropped, followed by a pause, then laughter. The chicken that had been evicted from a window landed, shook itself, and resumed its day without comment. By then, the morning had fully committed. Not announced, not celebrated, simply present. People moved because stopping invited thought, and thought invited questions no one had time for. The village had found its rhythm again, uneven, noisy, stubborn, but intact. Another day had been claimed, not by precision or grace, but by habit and the refusal to lie back down. The woman finally managed to free her shoe with a careful twist of her ankle, wincing as the creature slid away and vanished into the damp earth like a thought she refused to finish. Throughout the ordeal, the weight on her back never shifted. The child slept on, trusting the slow sway of her mother's breathing more than any promise of comfort. She straightened, adjusted the strap across her chest, and resumed her mourning as if this small victory did not deserve acknowledgement. Across the village, ovens glowed with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Fires were fed cautiously, watched with suspicion, and blamed preemptively. Bakers pressed fingers to crusts, listening for the subtle signals that determined whether a loaf would nourish or punish. No one complained out loud. Teeth were considered optional tools in this place. Survival mattered more than enamel. Ingredients were not chosen so much as negotiated. What had not been eaten, sold, forgotten, or cursed at was folded into dough with resigned creativity. Every loaf carried a history of omissions. When a nut appeared, it was treated like a miracle and hidden from children who had sharp eyes and loose morals. When something harder appeared, it was quietly accepted and blamed on fate. At the edge of the settlement, Cricket leaned into his work with theatrical devotion. His voice drifted unevenly over the hedges, rising and falling with confidence unearned but sincere. He believed the act of singing mattered more than accuracy. His stove crackled, unimpressed. The loaf inside slumped slightly, then held. Cricket smiled anyway. Faith did not require results. Neighbors pretended not to listen. They pretended harder not to judge. When his singing peaked, they simply made arrangements elsewhere, trading favors and bread with the discretion of people who understood diplomacy. No one confronted him. Everyone valued access to bread more than silence. Morning faith arrived in fragments. Gestures passed from hand to hand without explanation. Some paused at thresholds, eyes closed just long enough to feel protected. Others tied objects, spoke phrases, or performed actions whose origins were lost, but whose repetition felt necessary. These habits survived not because they worked, but because abandoning them felt dangerous. The bell rang once, without conviction. It startled a bird, woke no one, and still achieved compliance. People moved. They always did. Authority did not need to be conscious to function here. By then, hunger had sharpened into routine. Smoke layered the air. Salt clung to skin. The smell of boiled grain settled everywhere, persistent and inescapable. Porridge thickened past usefulness, demanding either commitment or surrender. Ale warmed into something barely tolerable, but tolerated nonetheless. Bread cooled in uneven stacks, daring commentary it would never receive. And then they began to gather, not by announcement, but by instinct sharpened through years of observation. The well drew them as it always had, a place where necessity disguised itself as coincidence. They arrived one by one, claiming space with the authority of familiarity. Shawls were adjusted, cups emerged. Silence lingered only briefly. Bertha's arrival sealed the moment. Her presence carried the weight of precedent. She had seen enough to distrust enthusiasm and enough loss to justify curiosity. The cloth around her oatcakes was folded neatly, her mouth less so. Words followed immediately, without preamble, like sparks meeting dry grass. Martha received them with practiced doubt. Her life had been spent ushering others into the world and watching them disappoint expectations. She trusted patterns more than people. Agnes listened without moving, eyes alert, posture unassuming. She said little, which made every word count. The well responded with a sound that could have been coincidence. The bucket swayed gently, rope fibers whispering under strain. No one acknowledged it, but everyone noticed. Speculation took shape quickly. Details were repeated, refined, and sharpened. Color became motive. Requests became evidence. Past behavior was retrieved and rearranged to support conclusions that felt satisfying, if not fair. This was not cruelty. This was maintenance. In their minds, watching closely prevented worse outcomes. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, judgments had settled into something solid. Not permanent, never that, but sufficient for the morning. Tomorrow would offer revisions. Someone always did. The village continued around them, unaware that its reputation had been quietly adjusted. Smoke rose, work resumed, children ran, bread cooled, and the women by the well leaned back, sipping tea gone too strong, content in the knowledge that order, however fragile, had been preserved for another day. The nod passed through the circle like a verdict rendered without the inconvenience of trial. It was not approval, not agreement, but recognition, a shared acknowledgement born of long practice. These women had perfected that gesture over decades, using it to weigh neighbors, assess intentions, and quietly file away behaviors for future reference. It carried history in the tilt of the chin alone. When the fourth figure eased herself down, the bench protested softly, but no one offered help. Assistance implied weakness, and weakness invited commentary. She positioned the stool with care, as though placement mattered, and drew out her food with ceremonial slowness. The apple resisted her teeth, forcing a pause that stretched the moment just long enough for the others to lean in. Bodies angled, not out of curiosity, but expectation. What she shared landed heavily, the kind of observation that did not need embellishment. The pause that followed was not shock, but calculation. Eyes shifted, mouths closed. Someone swallowed without realizing it. This was the sort of information that did not fade. It rooted itself. Questions followed. Not to clarify, but to sharpen. Details were added, not because they were proven, but because they fit. A bruise suggested momentum. Hay suggested proximity. Proximity suggested intent. Intent, once suggested, required no further evidence. The past week's sermon resurfaced, not quoted, but remembered in tone, in posture, in the way certain words had lingered too long in the air. The animal that passed behind them went entirely unacknowledged. Its presence did not matter. There were priorities here, and beasts of burden rarely made the list unless they misbehaved spectacularly. Today's misbehavior belonged to people. The conversation widened. New names entered, some reluctantly, others eagerly. Midnight gardening became suspicious by default. Timing alone was enough to condemn. Plants did not require explanation. People did. And explanations were rarely satisfactory. Their sighs were synchronized, not with sorrow, but strategy. The release of breath that followed consensus. The understanding that something had been properly noted. When the girl approached, everything paused again. The volume dropped, eyes sharpened. She became a test without knowing it. Every movement was measured, every hesitation recorded. Warnings were issued with a softness that masked intent. Humor was employed as camouflage. The result was predictable. The girl retreated with damp fabric and a lesson she would not consciously remember but would carry all the same. The assessment of her followed quickly. Quiet was not a virtue in this place. Quiet invited projection. Listening was dangerous. Listening meant remembering, and remembering meant returning. Laughter arrived unexpectedly, brief and brittle. It did not erase the judgment, only softened its edges. Beneath it lay familiarity, a recognition of shared longevity. They did not name it affection. That would have made it vulnerable. Attention shifted easily, as it always did, to animals and their sins. The pig's behavior was dissected with the same seriousness reserved for moral failings. Sacredness and blasphemy were debated not as opposites, but as adjacent possibilities. Men were compared unfavorably. No objections were raised. Food circulated. Eating continued. No one discussed methods. The results spoke for themselves. These women did not cook for pleasure. They cooked because it was required. Resentment was an ingredient, not a flaw. As the sun climbed, warmth reached the bench at last. Bones loosened. Conversation thinned, then thickened again with new observations. A limp here, a smile there, both suspicious in equal measure. By the time shadows shortened, the village had been thoroughly reviewed. Tomorrow was already accounted for. Elsewhere, in a structure built to impress rather than comfort, the quiet was of a different sort. Paper rasped softly. Wood creaked under concentrated weight. Time stretched thin around a solitary figure, bent over work that demanded precision but offered no reward. The task continued, not because it mattered, but because it existed. Ink threatened disaster with every movement. The body responded poorly, unpredictably, as though rebelling against the monotony imposed upon it. Outside those walls, gossip carried heat. Inside, silence carried pressure. Both were forms of endurance. Both would leave marks. The longer Lionel remained seated, the more the room itself seemed to conspire against him. The air was thick with expectation, the kind that does not shout, but presses gently and constantly, like a hand resting on the back of the neck. Every surface felt complicit. The desk bore old scars from previous scribes, shallow grooves where quills had dug in during moments of frustration long forgotten by everyone except the wood itself. His body betrayed him in small, methodical ways. The bridge of his nose throbbed. His eyes burned from hours of focusing on lines that refused to stay straight no matter how carefully he aligned them. Even his jaw ached, locked too tightly in the effort of appearing calm. The manner rewarded composure, not accuracy. Panic was acceptable only if it was silent. He worked on, knowing that the document in front of him was already condemned to misunderstanding. It would be unfurled later beneath polite candlelight, admired for its seals and margins rather than its substance. The words would be flattened into sound, drained of meaning as soon as they left the page. Lionel understood this, and it made the labor feel both pointless and dangerous. Pointless because no one cared what it said. Dangerous because they cared deeply that it existed. The steward's earlier visit lingered in his thoughts like a stain he could not scrub out. That voice, cheerful and absolute, carried the peculiar cruelty of men who had never held a quill long enough for it to hurt. Perfection, demanded without context, without regard for the fact that perfection was not something the manor ever returned to those who served it. Lionel had watched other scribes age into stoops and coughs, their hands trembling not from weakness but from memory. He continued writing because stopping would have drawn attention, and attention was more lethal than mistakes. Every letter he formed was deliberate, overworked, polished beyond necessity. He added flourishes not because they were beautiful, but because they suggested effort, and effort passed for virtue here. The ink dried unevenly, some lines sinking into the parchment as if ashamed, others sitting glossy on the surface like they refused to commit. At some point in the afternoon, the room grew warmer. Sunlight crept across the floor in a slow, accusatory crawl. Dust motes drifted lazily, unconcerned with law, property, or goose ownership. Lionel envied them. They were free to move without consequence. A faint sound drew his attention downward. Near the wall, almost invisible in the shifting light, a mouse lingered. It sat on its haunches, whiskers twitching, watching Lionel's hand with interest. Not fear. Interest. The creature had learned, like everyone else in the manor, that the real danger lay elsewhere. Lionel stared back at it for a long moment. The mouse did not retreat. It simply adjusted its posture and remained. That was when the thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. Perhaps none of this was meant to be read. Perhaps documents existed only to be seen, to be displayed as proof that something official had occurred. Meaning was optional. Appearance was mandatory. Wax seals mattered more than clauses. Names mattered more than sense. If so, Lionel reasoned, then the charter was already complete the moment it looked authoritative enough to intimidate. The realization did not comfort him. He pressed on, revising nothing, correcting little, trusting that confidence in ink would outweigh accuracy. His stomach growled, then gave up. His shoulders slumped, then straightened again out of habit. Time passed in uneven chunks, marked not by bells but by the gradual stiffening of his fingers. When he finally rose, it was with the careful slowness of a man exiting a battlefield littered with his own failed attempts. The parchment, rolled and bound, felt heavier than it should have, not with importance, but with accumulated exhaustion. He held it briefly, considering how many hands would touch it without ever sensing the effort embedded in its fibers. The last mishap came as no surprise. By then, Lionel had come to accept that the day would not release him cleanly. The spill was inevitable, almost courteous in its timing, as if the room itself wished to ensure he left properly marked. He absorbed it without reaction, too tired even for outrage. Blame, he decided, would be assigned efficiently. The cat had already established its innocence by absence. That would suffice. Lionel exited the room with measured steps, posture intact, expression neutral. Anyone watching would have seen a scribe completing his duty. No one would have seen the small surrender inside him, the quiet understanding that tomorrow would bring more parchment, more demands, more insistence on perfection from people incapable of recognizing it. That evening, the charter would be read aloud. Heads would nod. Words would echo meaninglessly against stone walls. Authority would be affirmed. And Lionel, somewhere out of sight, would be scrubbing ink from his hands, knowing that the battle had not ended, only paused. Edwin lay there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, staring up at the dark beams of the barn ceiling as if they might offer counsel. Dust drifted lazily above him, catching the thin light that slipped through the gaps in the boards. Somewhere, a spider paused mid-descent, reconsidered its life choices, and retreated. The barn, ancient and indifferent, absorbed the humiliation without comment. It had seen worse. It would see worse again. He pushed himself upright with a groan, joints already protesting, like they'd been overused for decades rather than minutes. Straw clung to him with intimate familiarity, working its way into his collar, his sleeves, his dignity. Milk dripped from his chin. He wiped it away with a rag he'd been given, which only succeeded in smearing the evidence into a broader, more abstract shame. Gertrude shifted her weight again, slowly, deliberately, not threateningly. Worse, casually, as if Edwin were not a person but a minor inconvenience. The universe had dropped at her feet for entertainment. Her chewing never stopped. The rhythm was steady, confident, judgmental. Edwin retrieved the bucket like a knight reclaiming a fallen helm, though it now bore a dent that would forever remind him of this moment. He set it down carefully, aligning it with a precision born not of skill but terror. The stool creaked ominously as he sat, and he froze, waiting for it to collapse out from under him. It didn't. That small mercy felt undeserved. He glanced once toward the barn door, calculating distance, consequences, and the stable master's expression if he returned empty-handed. The thought of the latrines rose in his mind like a bad dream that refused to fade. He swallowed hard and turned back to Gertrude. "All right," he said again, softer this time, as if volume might provoke her. His voice cracked slightly. He pretended it hadn't. He reached out, hands steadier now, not because he was calmer, but because fear had finally settled into something manageable. He focused on the technique as he'd been told, replaying the instructions like a prayer. He squeezed gently its fingers, then the rest. Slowly, gently, respectfully, as if the udder were not attached to a creature capable of targeted violence. For a few heartbeats, it worked. Milk fell into the bucket in hesitant threads, pale and thin, but undeniably present. The sound was quiet, almost hopeful. Edwin held his breath, afraid that exhaling might ruin everything. His humming resumed without conscious thought, barely more than vibration in his throat. He imagined himself succeeding. He imagined walking back with the bucket full, the stable master nodding once in approval. He imagined being allowed to fail at something else tomorrow. Then the tail struck. The impact snapped his head sideways and sent stars bursting behind his eyes. The taste that filled his mouth was immediate and unmistakable. He gagged, sputtered, spat into the straw, and instinctively reached for the bucket, too late to save it. The milk spilled again, white against brown, soaking into the ground where it would benefit no one. Gertrude let out a long, satisfied exhale. Edwin slid off the stool and landed hard on his knees, blinking rapidly, trying to remember who he was and why he had ever agreed to this. His cheek throbbed, his lips burned. Somewhere in the barn, a hen clucked approvingly, as if she had placed a bet and just won. He stayed kneeling for a moment, hands resting uselessly on his thighs, chest rising and falling too fast. He did not cry. Crying felt like it would escalate the situation. Instead, he laughed once, short and hollow, the sound of a boy realizing that bravery was vastly overrated. "Right," he muttered. Lesson learned. What lesson? He wasn't sure. That cows were not to be reasoned with. That music was a lie. That respect was a one-way transaction. He stood slowly, dusted himself off as best he could, and inspected the damage. The bucket was scuffed. The stool leaned slightly to the left now, permanently offended. Edwin himself felt altered in ways he couldn't articulate. Older, perhaps, or simply more aware. Gertrude flicked her tail again, this time missing him by inches. Not an attack. A reminder. Edwin backed away with care, nodding to her like one might to a superior officer who had won decisively. "We'll talk later," he said, though both of them knew that was a lie. There would be no talking. There would only be future attempts and fresh humiliations. As he reached the barn door, the rooster outside let out another crow, sharp and triumphant. Edwin paused, looked up at the sky, and shook his head. Somewhere in the village, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, someone was ringing a bell without knowing why. The day was moving on without him, indifferent to his defeat. He stepped back into the light, smelling of hay and manure and failure, carrying an empty bucket and a lesson that would, indeed, haunt him for seasons to come. For a while, the field became its own separate kingdom, governed by rules invented 5 minutes earlier and forgotten just as quickly. The children scattered and regrouped in shifting alliances, loyalty changing hands with every thrown vegetable. Shouts overlapped, dirt flew. Someone tripped over absolutely nothing and blamed the ground for cheating. Thomas strutted through the chaos, issuing commands that contradicted each other with impressive confidence. One moment, he was directing a flanking maneuver around a particularly aggressive turnip patch. The next, he was on his knees, dramatically wounded, insisting that the rules clearly stated commanders were immune to dirt-related injuries. No one agreed. Several children pelted him in protest until he rescinded the decree. Marigold attempted, briefly, to restore order. She raised her voice, clapped her hands, and reminded them that they were supposed to be gathering weeds. This suggestion was received with the polite confusion usually reserved for foreign languages. Someone asked if weeds counted if they were thrown first. Someone else wanted to know whether shouting while pulling roots made it more effective. Marigold closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and decided supervision was a young person's mistake. Elsie eventually rose from her grassy deathbed, dusted herself off, and immediately fell again after being struck by an enthusiastic clod of earth. This time, she claimed, resurrection had weakened her legs. The others accepted this explanation without question. The smallest boy with the dandelion crown watched it all with solemn interest, occasionally clapping whenever someone fell particularly well. The scarecrow, ignored at first, soon became a strategic landmark. Someone climbed it despite explicit instructions not to, declaring it a lookout tower. Another child challenged this claim and attempted to scale it from the opposite side. The scarecrow leaned, protested silently, and lost part of an arm. The children cheered as if this had been the plan all along. From a distance, the scene looked like work only to the profoundly optimistic. Baskets lay abandoned, overturned, or repurposed as shields. Weeds remained stubbornly rooted, watching the proceedings with quiet victory. The barley field bore the marks of a morning enthusiastically wasted. Pip, having forgotten what he was warning people about earlier, now served as official announcer. He narrated events as they happened, loudly and inaccurately, declaring victories, defeats, and heroic sacrifices with equal enthusiasm. When two children collided headfirst and fell backward in unison, Pip proclaimed it a draw and demanded applause. The applause happened. No one knew why, but it felt right. The farmer glanced over again at some point, squinting against the sun. He considered intervening. He considered sighing. He considered neither worth the effort, and returned to his furrows, humming a tune that suggested long experience with disappointment. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, disguised as hunger. Shouts grew hoarser. Throws lost accuracy. The battles slowed into skirmishes, then into sulking. Children collapsed in the grass, chests heaving, faces streaked with dirt and triumph. One declared the war officially over. Another immediately disputed this and threw a final turnip in protest. It missed everyone and landed in a puddle, ending the argument by mutual embarrassment. When the distant bell rang for midday, it took a moment for anyone to react. The sound floated over the field like an afterthought. Slowly, reluctantly, the children gathered themselves, brushing off grass and mud, retrieving baskets that were conspicuously light. Marigold inspected her own basket, which contained exactly one weed and a stone she didn't remember picking up. She nodded to herself, as if this were symbolic. They drifted back toward the village in loose formation, still arguing about who had won, who had cheated, and who had been struck the hardest. Thomas limped exaggeratedly, nursing an injury that would vanish the moment someone suggested chores. Pip continued narrating the retreat, though no one was listening anymore. Behind them, the field settled into silence. The weeds remained. The scarecrow leaned a little more than before. The soil, churned and bruised, bore the evidence of a morning spent pretending. By the time the children reached the edge of the village, they were already planning the next important task, one that would, with equal dedication, achieve absolutely nothing. By the time the clump of moss was declared magical, the war had already slowed into something softer and stranger. It sat cupped in a small, filthy palm, green and damp, held up like a relic rescued from battle. The child who owned it swore it pulsed when squeezed. No one else felt anything, but no one challenged it either. Luck, in this village, was fragile. You didn't mock it aloud. Marigold watched all of this from her place near the edge of the field, arms folded, jaw tight. She had given up shouting not because she was tired, but because she had learned something important that morning. No one listened. Not to reason, not to rules, not even to logic, shouted at full volume. So, she stacked stones instead, one on top of another, slow, careful, balanced. Each rock placed like a quiet argument against chaos. For a few minutes, it worked. The tower rose knee-high, then higher, drawing curious looks. Someone whistled. Someone nodded in respect. Marigold felt a small, dangerous pride bloom in her chest. Then the parsnip flew. It struck the stone's dead center, scattering her effort in a clatter that sounded far too final. Laughter erupted. Someone declared the fortress destroyed. Someone else claimed victory. Marigold did not react. She simply stared at the ruins, lips pressed together, memorizing the feeling. It would come back later in life. She didn't know how yet, only that it would. The rabbit hole announcement cut through the noise like a spell. Even Thomas stopped mid-boast. Children gathered, crouched, held their breath. Dirt-smudged faces leaned close to the ground, eyes wide with hope that something small and alive might appear and prove the morning had meant something. Nothing did. Disappointment settled in slowly, then curdled into argument. Names were proposed, rejected, defended with surprising ferocity. Pip liked the grand ones. Elsie preferred the ridiculous. Thomas insisted the rabbit would have chosen something heroic if it had shown itself. No one could agree, which meant the whole remained nameless and therefore unresolved. Like many things in the village, eventually, laughter took over again. The kind that comes when bodies are exhausted and minds are light. Children collapsed where they stood, gasping, clutching their sides. Elsie laughed so hard she hiccuped and decided this too counted as an injury. Thomas lay back with his arms spread, staring at the sky as if expecting it to applaud. When the bell reached them, faint and unimpressive, it felt intrusive, like being told to stop dreaming. Groans rippled through the field. No one wanted to leave yet. The fighting hadn't finished properly. The stories hadn't settled. They stood anyway. Thomas leaned heavily on his shovel as if it were a cane, milking sympathy with practiced ease. Pip carried his turnip like proof of survival. Marigold lifted her basket and looked inside. One weed. She almost smiled. As they passed the barn, Gertrude watched. She always did. Her massive head turned slowly, eyes following them with an expression that suggested deep skepticism about children and the adults who made them. One of the smaller boys waved. Gertrude did not respond. Authority, she knew, was not obligated to acknowledge effort. The field behind them looked battered. Soil torn, roots exposed, vegetable corpses scattered like evidence. And yet, nothing essential had changed. The weeds stood. The land waited. Hunger crept in quietly. It started as a distraction, then became a demand. Children grew irritable. Adults began calculating. Midday did not arrive as an announcement, but as a collective realization that continuing without food would lead to unpleasant consequences. Eating happened wherever opportunity allowed. Some ate standing. Some leaned against walls. Some hovered near doors, pretending not to beg. Thomas bartered stories for bites. Pip exaggerated injuries. Elsie accepted pity with theatrical grace. Marigold ate quietly, counting chews, thinking about stone towers and parsnips, and how easily things fell apart. By the time bellies stopped growling, the village had returned to its usual shape. Nothing had been accomplished, no weeds removed, no lessons learned. But the children carried something back with them anyway. Scrapes, inside jokes, new stories, already being reshaped for later telling. And somewhere in the churned dirt of the field, the unnamed rabbit hole waited, empty and patient, holding its silence like a secret that would outlast them all. If the shoemaker had been asked later whether anyone entered his cottage that afternoon, he would have said no. Not because no one did, but because afternoons blurred for him in a way mornings never had. Afternoons were for drifting, for letting the world continue without supervision. The step creaked once, then again. The sound traveled through the crooked floorboards like a polite question. The man under the bench shifted, but did not wake. His breathing adjusted, deeper now, settling into the kind of sleep earned by years of working until the body simply decided otherwise. Outside, lunch loosened its grip on the village. Hands returned to tools, voices lowered. Children were redistributed to whatever tasks adults still pretended might happen. The chaos of eating faded into the quieter disorder of labor. Inside the cottage, light crept slowly across the floor, tracing the outline of scattered shoes like a census of unfinished obligations. Each pair carried a story the cobbler knew by feel alone. He could tell who dragged their heels, who favored one foot, who stood too long, who ran when they should not have. Leather remembered things people denied. A fly buzzed, circled the sleeping man's head, and landed briefly on the brim of his hat. It paused, unimpressed, then moved on. Even insects understood the boundaries of that space. The cobbler dreamed of stitching, though his hands did not move. In his dream, the needle never snagged, the thread never knotted. Every shoe fit the first time. Customers paid exactly what they owed and did not sigh while doing it. It was not a grand dream. It was a practical one. The door creaked again. This time, someone lingered. Lyle stood at the threshold, still chewing sour leaves, eyeing the scattered footwear with the fascination of someone encountering order disguised as mess. He had been sent, officially, to return a borrowed strap. Unofficially, he was hiding from a task involving water and scrubbing. He took one careful step inside, then another, wincing at each sound the floor made. He noticed the sleeping man last. Lyle froze. Adults asleep in the middle of the day felt illegal, sacred, dangerous. He watched the slow rise and fall of the cobbler's chest, the open mouth, the complete lack of concern. It unsettled him. Grown men, in Lyle's experience, were meant to be loud, annoyed, or issuing instructions. This one was doing none of those things. Lyle set the strap down carefully on the bench, then hesitated. The temptation to test fate was immediate. He reached out, barely touching the edge of a boot, just enough to make sure it was real. It was. The cobbler snorted softly, turned his head, and muttered something about souls. Lyle flinched back like he'd been struck, heart racing, then slowly relaxed when the man did not wake. He grinned, the kind of grin earned only through near disaster. He slipped out, victorious. Inside, the cobbler shifted again, one arm flopping awkwardly, knocking over a sandal with a dull thud. He grumbled, rolled onto his back, and blinked awake at last. For a long moment, he lay there, staring up at the underside of the bench, as if it were a ceiling he recognized but did not fully trust. He sat up slowly, joints protesting. The afternoon had advanced without him. The light told him that much. He rubbed his face, pushed the hat back, and surveyed the room. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing stolen. Something returned. That was unusual. He picked up the strap, turned it over once, and nodded to himself. Someone had done a decent thing quietly. That counted. Outside, the village resumed its steady churn. The beekeeper shouted once, then stopped. The blacksmith's hammer rang out again. Somewhere, Gertrude lowed with authority. Children laughed, then were shushed, then laughed again at a more appropriate volume. The cobbler rose, stretched, and went back to work. He chose a boot at random and threaded his needle. The rhythm returned to his hands like a language he never quite forgot. Each stitch pulled tight against the day's softness, anchoring time in small, necessary motions. Lunch had passed. Nothing remarkable had changed. People were fed enough to continue. Tasks resumed. Shoes would be mended. Fields would remain imperfect. Children would remember only the best parts. And the village, having survived another midday, leaned forward into the afternoon, ready to repeat itself with minor variations and the same stubborn insistence on continuing. Father Aldrich remained frozen longer than was dignified, though dignity had already abandoned him several minutes earlier. The silence of the sacristy pressed in, heavy with expectation and dust. Candles stood unlit where they should not have been. The lectern stared back at him with an almost accusatory patience. Somewhere beyond the stone walls, the bell's echo faded, leaving behind the dreadful space where memory should have lived. He tried breathing. That usually worked. Slow inhale, hold, exhale. Nothing returned. The words did not rearrange themselves. They did not drift back politely. They were gone, not misplaced but evacuated, as if his own mind had decided to perform a quiet cleansing. Aldrich pressed his lips together and nodded once, as if agreeing with an invisible advisor. He reached for the scroll on the table and unrolled it with care, hoping familiarity would spark recognition. The ink stared back at him, orderly and unreadable. He knew it was scripture. He knew it mattered. He knew with absolute certainty that at some point today he had known exactly what it said. This was not the first time. He had learned, over years of gentle panic, that sermons did not require memory so much as confidence. Words, spoken with enough conviction, often assembled themselves mid-sentence. The faithful rarely noticed when one verse slid into another. Some even preferred it that way. It felt more personal, more inspired. He straightened his robe, smoothing creases that did not matter, and stepped toward the chapel door. Each footfall echoed too loudly. His heart kept pace, thudding with unhelpful enthusiasm. He told himself that forgetting was human, that grace accounted for gaps, that no one truly expected perfection despite what the saints suggested. Inside the nave, villagers gathered with the careful movements of people transitioning into reverence. Benches creaked. A child was hushed. Someone coughed. and apologized to no one in particular. Faces turned forward, eyes lifted. Aldrich mounted the pulpit and rested his hands on the wood. It felt solid, reliable. He liked that. He cleared his throat once, then again, buying time the way all men did when confronted by their own emptiness. He began with a greeting. It came out steady, warm, familiar. Encouraged, he continued, speaking of duty, of patience, of the quiet labor that bound the village together. He did not quote scripture. He circled it. He described it from memory's shadow, relying on tone and cadence rather than text. Heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. The sound buoyed him. Outside, evening settled in earnest. Smoke thinned. Tools were set down. Animals were counted and recounted. The shoemaker, still under his bench, shifted slightly, dreaming now of gravy cooling just enough not to burn. Joss paused his sweeping to listen for the bell and smiled when it rang, knowing it meant no more customers today. Children drifted home, slower now, their earlier energy folded into tired limbs and half-finished arguments. Mothers counted heads, fathers washed hands. Someone tripped over the same loose stone as always. In the chapel, Aldrich found his rhythm. Words came easier once he stopped chasing the missing passage. He spoke of forgiveness without naming its source, of rest as necessity, not indulgence, of the danger of working until the soul forgot its shape. More nods. One woman wiped her eyes, unsure why. By the time the final blessing left his mouth, Aldrich realized something important. He had not remembered the sermon. He had replaced it. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. As people filed out, satisfied in that quiet, unexamined way, Aldrich returned to the sacristy and finally laughed, a short, breathy sound he quickly swallowed. He wiped his brow, folded the scroll without looking at it again, and resolved to feed the geese before attempting any further thinking. Night approached gently. Windows glowed. Dogs settled. Somewhere, a pie was cut that did not exist anywhere but dreams. And the village, having eaten, worked, forgotten, and forgiven itself just enough for one day, leaned into evening with the practiced ease of a place that knew tomorrow would ask very little different. The chamber resembled less a room than a defeated storage nook that had lost interest in order. Vestments drooped across furniture like exhausted witnesses. Wax tapers slanted at uneasy angles, their bases fused to surfaces they no longer remembered choosing. A ceremonial cup lay inverted atop a pile of hymn books, whose only remaining duty had been to stabilize a stool that leaned with philosophical intent. Somewhere within the shadows, a rodent moved freely, emboldened by the assumption that sacred ground implied immunity. Father Aldrich stood amid the clutter, murmuring to himself while shifting parchment, thumbing through volumes, and uncovering a hardened fragment of bread that had long since crossed from nourishment into doctrinal liability. He frowned. He distinctly recalled holding the passage earlier. He crouched, inspected beneath the table, peered behind the altar, even opened the narrow cabinet where years earlier he had accidentally imprisoned a ceremonial garment for an entire season and only rediscovered it during a completely unrelated holy observance. Nothing. The text had vanished. Then, awareness arrived from below. Cold stone pressed directly against skin. Aldrich glanced downward. Bare feet, pale, offended, and clearly uninvited. He inhaled sharply. Again. Sliding across the floor, he reached the corner where a contingency solution waited. Footwear of uncertain origin, formerly belonging to a monk whose limbs had clearly disagreed on proportions. The shoes met his feet without argument. Symmetry, he accepted long ago, was not a priority of devotion. Beyond the chapel entrance, motion gathered. The baker's spouse conversed with the apothecary, conversation likely drifting between fermentation and morality. Children hurled small stones towards sacred woodwork, while loudly insisting their activity qualified as recreation rather than blasphemy. Nearby, Trig rested against a barrel, asleep in the particular posture of someone destined to become an obstacle after sunset. Aldrich wiped his brow. Vespers. Evening service meant illumination, reassurance, contrition. Also footwear. He paused. No, footwear was resolved. Focus. He seized the nearest scripture volume, rifled through pages with culinary urgency, and stopped upon a narrative involving shared provisions and improbable multiplication. That would do. Sufficiency, faith, providence arriving despite misplacement. Acceptable, useful, comforting, mildly nourishing in theme. He adjusted his robe, concealing hardened wax where it offended the eye, and whispered a plea, not for recollection, for endurance. Memory had never been reliable. On one unfortunate occasion, he had delivered matrimonial rites during an infant blessing. The child remained unaffected. The adults departed, bewildered yet optimistic. Stepping into the chapel, amber glow met him. Faces turned. Expressions hovered between drowsy and hopeful. He smiled with the expression of someone realizing humiliation too late for remedy. "Good evening," he offered, volume carrying slightly farther than planned. "Tonight we speak of faith." The book lifted, protective rather than instructive. Orientation, uncertain, he began. Preparation often convinces us of readiness. Confidence follows effort. Yet, sometimes certainty dissolves, leaving us unguarded within sacred walls. A pause, a breath. Eyes drifted downward toward mismatched footwear. Laughter murmured. Small things vanish. Objects. Patience. Entire teachings prepared with care. Yet memory does not govern everything. Grace remains present regardless. Agreement moved through the pews. Someone whispered affirmation. Another corrected them gently. Aldrich continued, voice settling, cadence forming without conscious design. Meaning surfaced not through precision but intention. By conclusion, no one suspected improvisation. The gathering dispersed lighter. The children abandoned their ammunition. Trig stirred, released an involuntary sound approximating blessing. Later, within the emptied chamber, Aldrich lowered himself onto a bench, removed the offending shoes, and released breath into his palms. The missing manuscript remained absent. He found he did not resent that. Tom realized far too quickly that working the beat field beside Anwin was both a terrible idea and the best one he'd had all week. Terrible, because his thoughts refused to line up in any sensible order. Perfect, because there was nowhere else in the village where silence felt this heavy, this deliberate, as if the air itself had decided to watch them closely. The soil clung to his boots with every step, stubborn and damp, like it didn't believe in goodbyes. The sun hung high above them, unhelpful and unapologetic, and the beets themselves seemed equally uninterested in being harvested. Thick, round, rooted deep with quiet defiance. This stretch of land was communal, which meant everyone took turns pretending beet work mattered, while mostly talking, arguing, and silently comparing root sizes. Today, the pretending had placed him next to Anwin. Tom knew exactly whose doing this was. Margold never pushed people into trouble. She simply arranged the path so they'd trip on their own. He pulled a beet free and stared at it longer than necessary, then spoke just to prove he still could. Something about how round they were today. The sentence landed stiffly. like a tool used for the wrong job. Anwen looked up. There was dirt on her nose, a faint smear that Tom noticed instantly and then tried very hard not to stare at. She agreed, dryly, that they were extremely beet-like. Then she compared one to her uncle's head. Tom couldn't tell if that was an insult or a compliment. He decided it didn't matter. She smiled anyway. A bird chirped somewhere beyond the field. Tom had the distinct impression it was laughing at them. He wiped his hands on his tunic, making the stains worse, and tried again. This time, he offered her another beet, one with a crooked shape and a shallow groove that looked suspiciously like a grin. He said it was smiling. Anwen examined it with exaggerated seriousness and declared it looked evil. Like his sister, Tom barely had time to feel victorious before a clump of soil struck his boot. He fell back on purpose. Not entirely on purpose, but enough. The ground was soft. He spread his arms and stared up at the sky as if struck down by a bolt of agricultural lightning. Anwen's laughter burst out, louder than it needed to be. That made it worth it. He stayed down longer than necessary. When he spoke again, it was quieter. Careful, he suggested, tentatively, that if Anwen were a beet, she would be a special one, the kind saved for feast days, regal, important. The words sounded braver in his head than they did in the open air. She countered smoothly, saying he'd be the one with a hole through it. Odd, damaged, somehow charming anyway. Tom accepted the loss with a smile he couldn't suppress. A cart rattled past on the nearby road. Neither of them looked. Whatever the world was doing elsewhere could wait. Anwen plucked a leaf from a weed and twirled it between her fingers. She mentioned her mother. Rules. Warnings. Tom replied with his own mother, who believed conversation itself was a hazard. The truth of it hung between them, awkward and oddly comforting. The question escaped him too fast. About other boys. He regretted it immediately when Anwen raised an eyebrow. He corrected himself just as quickly, admitting it wasn't every girl, only the ones who distracted him while he was elbow-deep in tubers. She didn't blush, not obviously, but she blinked slower and looked down, as if the dirt had suddenly become fascinating. She said she didn't talk to many boys. Most of them, she explained, didn't say anything worth hearing. Tom nearly smiled too wide. He caught himself in time. He admitted he'd once written a poem about turnips. The confession felt reckless the moment it left his mouth. Anwen's eyes lit up. She told him to recite it. The worst ones, she said, were always the best. Tom sat up, wiped his hands, and cleared his throat with all the dignity of a knight whose armor was mostly mud. He recited the poem. It was earnest. It was terrible. He finished and waited. Anwen laughed until she had to hide her face in her apron. She called him an idiot. She also admitted she loved it. She warned him that if he ever recited it again in public, she would bury him in beets. Tom found that deeply romantic. They sat in silence after that, not touching, not moving, just breathing in soil and sun and something unnamed. A goat bleated in the distance. Tom mentioned goats. Anwen judged the attempt poorly. Tom said he was warming up. Threats involving fathers, crossbows, and running speed were exchanged with grins that blurred the edges of the world. Then she asked if they should walk back together. Her voice was soft, almost lost to the breeze. Tom knew the answer before he thought about it. He said yes. They stood, too close, not close enough. Their shoulders nearly brushed. The wind became suddenly interesting. He almost reached for her hand. He stopped. She noticed. She said nothing. They started walking. slowly, leaving behind half-dug rows, unharvested beets, and a field that no longer felt like it was holding him in place. Tom didn't know where any of this would lead. He only knew that, for the first time that day, the ground had finally let him go. She placed the beet in his palm before he could say anything else. It was the crooked one, the one that had smiled first. "For your poems," she said. Tom accepted it with exaggerated care, as if it were a relic dug from sacred ground rather than something pulled from dirt an hour earlier. He nodded once. "I'll keep it safe." He meant it. They began walking back toward the village, slowly, deliberately. At first, there was a full step of space between them, then half of one. The path was narrow, packed earth worn smooth by years of feet that had all gone home thinking about different things. Tom reached for her hand without looking. His fingers hovered, then retreated. Anwin noticed. She said nothing. She simply let the quiet stretch, unbroken and unpunishing. Behind them, the field told its own story. Rows bent at odd angles. Baskets sat half-filled, abandoned mid-task. Laughter still echoed faintly, not loud enough to follow, not quiet enough to forget. Love in a beet field was never elegant. It stumbled. It blushed. It hid behind jokes and shared vegetables and the constant fear of being seen. But for Tom and Anwin, clumsy as it was, it felt complete. Beyond the last furrow and past the edge of the monastery grounds, where the herb garden gave up and the stone wall began to crumble into memory, lived Brother Cuthbert. He technically had a cell. The monks could point to it if asked. A small room, bare stone, narrow bed. He was rarely there. Cuthbert preferred the woods, the pond, or sometimes a crouched position behind the chapel, whispering to slugs with grave concentration. The choice depended entirely on the day. He was not like the other monks, and this was apparent almost immediately. For one thing, he collected feathers, not quills, not relics, owl feathers, hundreds of them. He sorted them by length, by shade, and by what he called emotional weight. He tucked them into the wide sleeves of his robe like bookmarks for thoughts he had not finished thinking. Occasionally, one would slip free mid-conversation and fall to the ground. Cuthbert would stop speaking instantly and pursue it with the urgency of a man rescuing sacred scripture. He also spoke to trees, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He paused for their answers. He nodded when they responded. He referred to the oak near the well as Father Elrich and insisted the maple by the brook wept sap on behalf of sinners. "Some people hear angels," he once explained calmly. "I hear bark." And then there were the spoons. Brother Cuthbert carved spoons with a skill that unsettled everyone who witnessed it. No one had taught him. He claimed the wood already knew what it wanted to be. He merely listened. One afternoon, he picked up a twisted branch, muttered something about hidden shape, and by sunset had produced a ladle so refined that the abbot refused to use it, citing the risk of spiritual offense. Every spoon was different. Some curved like spirals, others ended in bird-like beaks. One bore the faint outline of a woman's face etched into its bowl. Anyone who stared at it too long felt vaguely apologetic without knowing why. The monastery kitchen possessed dozens of these spoons, yet the cook used only one. The rest were displayed or possibly kept for defense, depending on her mood. No one knew where Cuthbert had come from. He arrived one mist-heavy morning carrying a satchel filled with moss, 3 acorns, and a carved badger he claimed could smell sin. The abbot, having once spent 6 hours chasing a goose through the cloister and losing decisively, decided he had no authority to turn anyone away, and welcomed him without further questions. Since then, Cuthbert had become both curiosity and legend. Novices whispered that he healed a pigeon using only breath and patience. Others swore lightning had struck him twice, and that he had thanked the sky both times. A few insisted he kept a journal written entirely in bird footprints. When asked directly, Cuthbert merely smiled. "Some truths," he said, "are feathered." The villagers treated him with a careful mix of reverence and concern. Children left offerings of buttons and dandelions near his door. Old women crossed themselves when he passed, then asked for charms just in case. Young men dared one another to ask him questions, such as what he dreamed about, and then fled when he actually answered. "Mostly echoes," he once said. "Sometimes jam." The abbot attempted, at one point, to give him a proper duty: script copying. Cuthbert agreed enthusiastically, and returned the parchment filled with frogs wearing various hats. When asked which gospel it represented, he replied, "Mark, probably." Gardening was assigned instead. He planted in spirals. Cabbages grew in perfect circles that repelled snails. Lettuce emerged in the shape of a fish, accidentally honoring a saint no one had mentioned in generations. The harvest was excellent. No one questioned the method again. For all his strangeness, Brother Cuthbert was loved. He never missed morning prayers, even when he arrived, soaked from the stream or wearing a crown of thistles. He listened better than anyone. When Brother Alwyn lost his mother, Cuthbert sat beside him all night, saying nothing, carving a spoon shaped like a weeping tree. And so he lived at the edge of the monastery, half within it, half elsewhere, a quiet figure among feathers, wood, and listening trees. Not mad, not holy in the usual way. Something adjacent, something the village accepted without needing to understand. When Alwyn's mother died, Brother Cuthbert did not offer prayers out loud, nor did he attempt comfort in words. He simply sat beside the boy from dusk until dawn, the two of them sharing the same cold stretch of floor. Cuthbert worked a small block of wood the entire night, his knife moving with slow patience, shaping it into a spoon whose handle curved downward like a willow bending over water. Alwyn cried, Cuthbert carved. Neither of them spoke. By morning, the spoon was finished, and something in the room felt quieter, as if grief had been given a place to rest. There were other stories like that, ones told softly, with a mixture of certainty and disbelief. Once, a bandit had wandered too close to the monastery, hungry, armed, and confident in his poor decisions. Cuthbert met him on the path with nothing but a long, unmoving stare and a fistful of dried mushrooms. No threats were spoken, no weapons raised. Whatever passed between them was invisible, but effective. The bandit fled. A week later, the same man returned. He brought with him a borrowed walking staff he claimed to have taken by accident. He also brought his goat. He asked, politely, if Brother Cuthbert might bless it. Cuthbert did so without hesitation, using 3 owl feathers and a chant that sounded ancient, or possibly invented on the spot. The goat walked away calmer, more focused, and according to its owner, less argumentative. It was never quite the same afterward, though everyone agreed the change was for the better. At meals, Cuthbert rarely spoke. When he did, it was never what anyone expected. Once, halfway through a bowl of pottage, he looked up and said, "The moon is a borrowed tooth." No one asked him to explain. Heads nodded. It felt correct in the way some truths do, even when they refuse to make sense. Sometimes, deep into the night, a monk would spot him behind the chapel, barefoot in the dirt. He moved slowly, arms extended, turning in careful arcs as though listening to music no one else could hear. His steps were deliberate, almost reverent, as if the ground itself were singing. No one stopped him. Eventually, a few of the younger monks began to join in. Awkward and uncertain, their movements clumsy but sincere. They danced in silence, learning nothing and everything at once. Was Cuthbert mad? Possibly. Was he wise? Perhaps more than most of them. But the common agreement was simpler than either. He was something else. A question the monastery had received without being required to answer. So he carved. He wandered. He spoke to trees, and if you listened closely, truly listened, the trees sometimes answered back. Down by the river, where the reeds leaned together like old men sharing secrets, and the water moved slowly enough to remember them, the women gathered with baskets full of laundry and mouths already prepared for conversation. The sun had barely cleared the hills, still stretching itself awake, but gossip was already in full motion. Laundry day was never truly about clothes. It was about rhythm, about scrubbing and speaking in tandem, about beating stains from fabric while casually dismantling reputations. The soap, made from ash and lard, was rough and unforgiving. It cleaned well enough, but its true work was done elsewhere. The older women arrived first. Their hands were wrinkled, their eyes sharp, their tongues well-oiled. They laid their linens out like tactical plans, rolled up their sleeves, and set to work with the focus of seasoned professionals. Each wet slap of cloth against stone marked a pause, a breath. A point made. "Did you hear what Ma's boy did with that hedge girl?" one asked, tossing a shirt down with theatrical flair. "No," another replied, scrubbing a sock that had clearly survived several questionable decisions. "But I'm hoping you're about to tell me." And just like that, the story began. Parts of it were true. Parts were invented. All of it was irresistible. The younger women arrived next, laughing, yawning, their baskets damp and heavy. They greeted their elders with respectful nods and arranged themselves along the bank, hands busy, ears wide open. Their minds were already stitching together last week's rumors with today's observations, forming patterns only they would ever fully recognize. Further down the line, a girl named Brenna dropped a tunic into the river. The water claimed it immediately. She shrieked, chased it with splashing desperation, and was rewarded with cheers and applause. When she returned, soaked and humiliated, an older woman handed her a cloth and remarked that the tunic had floated better than her chances with the butcher's son. Laughter followed, loud and unrestrained. It wasn't all cruelty. There was warmth beneath the barbs, affection wrapped in sarcasm. They pecked at one another like birds. But woe to anyone else who tried. Outsiders learned quickly that these women defended their own, with fists, soap bars, and memories sharpened by years of practice. Midway down the riverbank, sisters Ida and Ro worked side by side. Ro scrubbed loudly. Ida scrubbed harder. Ida's quiet nature made her an easy target. "So," Ro said casually, eyes fixed on the water, "you and Will were walking awfully close last market day." Ida said nothing. She twisted the tunic in her hands with unnecessary force. "You were smiling," Ro continued. "He must have said something funny, which is strange. He's never said anything funny in his life." There was a pause, long enough to be dangerous. Then Ida spoke, barely above a whisper. "He said he likes my laugh." Ro stopped scrubbing. She blinked once, slowly. There it was, a confession that had not meant to be said aloud and now could not be taken back. Ro smiled, like a cat that had just discovered an unlocked pantry. "That," she said sweetly, "is going to cost you 3 weeks of firewood chores if you want me to forget it." Ida sighed. 2 weeks. Roe considered this, then nodded. The river kept its secrets. For now, at the far edge of the riverbank, close to a stand of thin trees that leaned together like they shared opinions, Alfreda worked in silence. She hummed as she beat a tunic against the stone, a tunic that clearly belonged to her husband. With every strike, her humming grew louder, steadier, almost defiant. No one asked why. No one ever did. That was usually how it began. The longer the arms moved, the less careful the mouths became. Repetition had a way of loosening things. Muscles remembered their task. Minds wandered. Words slipped free. "I never liked a midwife," someone muttered, scrubbing viciously at a stain that may or may not have been real. "She smells like sour milk and talks too much about hips." A beat passed. Then another voice chimed in, lighter, reckless. "I kissed my cousin once." A pause. It was dark. I didn't know until afterward. Gasps erupted, followed immediately by cackles. "I put nettles in my mother-in-law's bedding." Someone else confessed, not loudly, but proudly. More laughter, louder this time. "I think my husband's dreaming about that tavern girl," one woman said, shaking water from a sleeve. "You think?" Another replied. "Mine moans her name in his sleep." They howled. One woman laughed so hard she dropped her wash bucket straight into the river. She had to wade in after it, skirts soaked, muttering prayers that were only technically Latin and mostly aimed at no one in particular. Above them, a soft breeze stirred the branches. Birds chirped, blissfully uninterested. A frog leapt into the shallows, misjudged the situation entirely, and immediately regretted it. By late morning, the riverbank had transformed into a landscape of drying cloth, damp hems, and freshly released secrets. Some women lay back in the grass, catching their breath. Others kept scrubbing long after the clothes were clean, simply because their hands needed something to do while their minds reorganized the damage. A girl who had barely spoken all morning suddenly said, into the quiet, "I think I want to marry someone who doesn't live here." Silence fell, brief but heavy. Then a soft voice replied, "Good luck finding one who wants to live with you." Laughter returned, gentler this time. Eventually the sun climbed too high to ignore. Work slowed, baskets were refilled, tunics folded. The river, now clouded with soap and sins, gurgled softly, as if promising to hold everything it had heard, at least until tomorrow. As they trudged back toward the village, arms full and mouths still busy, one thing was certain. Before the next bell rang, every confession would find a new kitchen wall to bounce off. The clothes would be clean. The stories would not. He arrived with a lute slung across his back, and the confidence of a man who mistook polite clapping for destiny. The villagers welcomed him, of course. That was the custom. When a minstrel passed through, you offered soup, a spot near the fire, maybe a corner of the barn if he didn't smell too strongly of regret. He would play a few songs, tell a story or two, and disappear with the next cart of turnips. This one did not disappear. At first, it was pleasant enough. He introduced himself as Sir Eldritch of the Seven Strings, though no one was entirely sure whether that referred to his instrument or something far less appropriate. He wore a hat adorned with an aggressively large feather and spoke almost entirely in poetic riddles, even when asking for directions. "In the year of our Lord," he once began solemnly, "might I inquire where yon latrine doth reside?" Old Murda pointed without looking up. "Over there," she muttered, "and don't narrate it." Eldritch performed in the square every evening without fail. The first night, the children danced. The second, the butcher's wife clapped along. By the fifth, most villagers developed urgent errands involving imaginary goats and excessively rearranged firewood. The trouble wasn't merely that he stayed. It was that he only knew 3 songs. Exactly 3. One concerned a brave knight hopelessly in love with a swan, which became increasingly uncomfortable the longer one thought about it. Another told the tale of a miller's daughter, using metaphors that raised several questions and answered none of them. The third, titled "The Wind Doth Moan for Thee," involved an alarming amount of literal moaning. Eldritch hit the same note at least 17 times. When asked if he knew anything else, he smiled as though he'd been mistaken for royalty. "Ah," he replied gently, "these are sacred compositions, forged beneath moonlight, muse, and slightly overcooked inspiration. It's not just the songs," the baker's son muttered to anyone who would listen. "It's how every story starts. In the year of our Lord," Eldritch would announce, regardless of topic, "a dragon. In the year of our Lord, a beast of flame. In the year of our Lord, a missing pie. In the year of our Lord, a most wicked pastry vanished." Once, he attempted to explain the rules of a dice game to the blacksmith using the same opening. The blacksmith listened patiently, nodded once, then threw the dice into the fire. And still, Eldritch remained. The blacksmith listened to the explanation of the dice game with the patience of a man accustomed to nonsense. He nodded once, politely, as Eldritch finished his dramatic opening. Then, without a word, he scooped up the dice and tossed them straight into the forge. The matter, in his mind, was settled. Eldritch lingered anyway. He spent long hours at the inn, sitting near the hearth, fingers drifting softly over the strings of his lute, waiting for someone to ask for a tune. No one did. He took this as a sign of anticipation rather than disinterest. When that failed, he wandered into the chapel, claiming the acoustics helped him commune with the divine. The priest listened for a full minute before gently asking him to stop turning psalms into limericks. Eldritch apologized sincerely and promised to keep the rhymes subtle. He wandered the fields next, serenading cows. "They're more forgiving than people," he sighed one afternoon, seated beside Gertrude, the largest cow in the village and the least impressed. Gertrude stared at him with the expression of a creature who had seen too much and approved of none of it. By the second week, Eldritch began inserting himself into conversations with alarming confidence. "You know," he would begin, "in the year of our..." "Don't." Someone would interrupt. "But he would..." another would mutter. The children started avoiding him, terrified of another rendition of the swan song. The apothecary swore her sleeping draughts were selling faster than ever. The innkeeper, who had first offered Eldritch a straw pallet out of courtesy, began hinting loudly that the weather was pleasant enough for sleeping beneath the stars. Eldritch took this as praise for his resilience. To be fair, he was not entirely useless. He helped carry baskets. He once patched a hole in the tavern roof, though he sang while doing it. He was unfailingly polite, inexplicably clean, and never stole so much as a crust. Still, his presence clung like flower dust. Sweet at first, impossible to remove, mostly irritating. A secret meeting was held behind the granary. What if they told him there was a music contest in the next village? Surely he would leave and return with a trophy. Could they bribe him with anything? Someone suggested patience, but supplies were low. Another proposed sending him into the forest to serenade bears. A third floated the idea of marriage. Surely someone, somewhere, would claim him eventually. No one followed through. They couldn't bring themselves to be cruel. Eldritch meant well. He smiled like a dog unaware it had tracked mud across the chapel floor, and he was always trying. One evening, the village gathered around the well. Lanterns swayed in a cool breeze. Eldritch appeared, lute in hand, eyes shining. "Friends," he began, "in the year of our Lord," the groans were immediate and unmistakable. "I shall perform a new piece," he announced. Heads snapped up. "New." He cleared his throat, strummed once, and fell silent. "I appear to have forgotten the second verse," he admitted sheepishly. "But I do remember the chorus." Unfortunately, the chorus was the moaning part. He sang it anyway. People laughed, not at the song itself, but at the situation. Someone handed him a crust of bread. A child danced badly. For a brief moment, the irritation softened. Eldritch was still terrible, but by then, he belonged to them. Every morning, just after sunlight spilled across the thatched rooftops, and well before anyone wanted consciousness, the village reeve began his rounds. His name was Eden. He carried himself with the solemn authority of a man given a job no one else wanted and everyone else was relieved to let him keep. He took boredom more seriously than most men took their vows. Eden wore the same brown cloak every day. Somehow it always looked both stiff and sagging, like it had opinions but lacked the courage to share them. A small wooden badge hung around his neck to mark his office, though most villagers assumed it was a token from a failed romance. He walked slowly, each step deliberate, as if approved in advance by a committee. In a way, it was. The role of reeve was largely ceremonial. Appearances mattered far more than results. He began at the eastern fence, where the slats had been missing since Candlemas. He squinted at the damage, rubbed his chin thoughtfully, and moved on without comment. That was the ritual. Inspect the fence. Do not repair the fence. Consider writing the fence down. "Morning, reeve," called a voice from the cowpen. Eden nodded. "A fair morning to you, Hilda. Fence is down again." "Yes," he replied gravely, like a man reporting a siege. "I've noticed." He did not stop. Stopping led to requests. Requests led to effort. So he continued past the broken fence, past the one held together with a belt, past the one replaced entirely with bundles of dried reeds and optimism. His next stop was the grain store. He checked the lock, which was not locked. He checked the hinges, which were mostly rust and prayer, and nodded once in satisfaction. Inside, a mouse stared back at him with the confidence of a creature that paid no taxes. Eden moved on. He tapped the wood twice, his personal definition of due diligence, and continued on. Inside the grain store, a mouse met his gaze with the unshakable confidence of a creature that paid no taxes and feared no authority. Eden acknowledged it with a nod that could have meant warning or respect. The mouse did not move. He walked the edge of the pasture next, where the sheep occasionally remembered their obligations. A few lifted their heads to look at him, unimpressed. One followed for several steps, then lost interest and wandered off in pursuit of something invisible. Eden stopped at a gate that was, in theory, still attached. In practice, it leaned at an angle that suggested philosophical doubt rather than structural failure. He rested a hand against it, sighed with the weight of a man who had seen too much wood rot, and stepped back. He gave it a slow nod, as if encouraging an aging colleague. "You are doing your best." By mid-morning, he reached the outer wall of the manor. It was tall, solid, and entirely beyond his authority. He studied it anyway, because ignoring something impressive felt rude. A servant passed, carrying a basket of apples. "Reeve," she said, dipping into a small curtsy. "Walls appear sturdy," Eden remarked, gesturing vaguely. She looked at the wall, then at him, then continued on her way without comment. At the well, Eden paused to inspect the rope. It had begun fraying the previous spring and had improved only in its dedication to continuing that trend. Still, water came up, and no one had fallen in recently, which placed the matter firmly in the category of future concern. He tugged once. The bucket creaked in protest. Satisfied, he moved on. His notebook remained mostly empty. From time to time he pretended to write, though the quill was dry and the ink had been forgotten somewhere 3 years earlier. It didn't matter. People respected the performance. That was the essence of the role. The village did not want a Reeve who solved problems. They wanted one who noticed them, frowned thoughtfully, and walked away like a man burdened with invisible calculations. He added the pigsty to his route, though it was not officially required. The pigs seemed to like him. Eden never understood why. Perhaps it was his pace. Perhaps it was because he never demanded anything of them. He leaned on the gate and watched as one pig rolled in the mud with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Must be nice," he murmured. Back on the main path, he passed the blacksmith, who was hammering something far too hot and far too loud to invite conversation. Eden raised a hand. "Fences holding up?" The blacksmith grunted. It could have meant yes. It could have meant leave me alone. Eden accepted it as confirmation. By the time he reached the final corner of the village, where an old millstone had been repurposed into a bench, the sun was high enough to justify stopping. He sat, exhaled, and removed his badge, setting it on his lap like a weight he was allowed to rest for a moment. He had fixed nothing, written nothing, improved nothing in any measurable way, yet every pair of eyes that had seen him knew the Reeve had made his rounds. That, in the village's estimation, was sufficient. A boy ran past with a broken bucket, water dripping behind him in an enthusiastic trail. Laughter followed. Eden watched them go, leaned back against the stone, and surveyed the village. It was still standing, mostly. The fences could wait. The mice were not unionized. If the sky stayed where it was until supper, he would consider the day a success. Boredom had endured. That was the real work. It began, as most disasters disguised as celebration do, with a bell. A single sharp clang rang out from the center of the square just after dawn. No one was scheduled to ring it. No feast had been declared. No saint had earned recognition. The crops had done nothing worthy of praise. Still, the sound echoed through the morning mist like a question no one wanted to answer. Then came the shouting. "Festival Day," someone yelled. No one knew who said it. That detail vanished immediately. The words jumped from mouth to mouth, quick and excited, like sparks in a dry barn. By the time the sun cleared the treetops, it was already accepted as truth. It's Festival Day. Of course it is. Long live the festival. What are we celebrating? Doesn't matter. There's pie, and that settled it. The baker, still wearing his nightshirt, stumbled outside to find 3 women pounding on his shutters. "I haven't made dough," he replied. "Then make some," they said. "The festival gods will be angry." He blinked. "We have festival gods today." "We do." The blacksmith's apprentice began tying ribbons to a fence post. The fence post collapsed. He tied the ribbons to a goat instead. The goat, named Oswald, and already known for questionable judgment, accepted the role with immediate authority. It rang like authority without paperwork, like an order no one could trace back to its source. One moment, the square was only half awake, dust drifting lazily between boots and cartwheels. The next, I felt it ripple through the crowd as if someone had dropped a bright coin into still water. Heads turned. Voices lifted. Certainty arrived without explanation. I am Oswald, and until that morning my ambitions had been limited to chewing rope and judging fences. But something about the way ribbons were tied around my horns, the way people stepped aside instead of pushing me away, convinced me that history had selected me for greater things. When the first barrel rolled too close, I lowered my head and struck it. The sound pleased me. It sounded official. I struck another. A cheer followed, which confirmed my suspicions. By the time the sun climbed high enough to warm the stones, the square had transformed into a place no one would later admit responsibility for. Music emerged in pieces, dragged from corners, and optimism rather than skill. A fiddle screamed bravely against its own limitations. A flute joined in out of confidence alone. Together they produced a noise that startled birds and encouraged clapping out of pure confusion. The butcher, emboldened by volume, announced a contest involving pies with unknown contents. People lined up anyway, smiling with the courage of those who had already accepted regret. Children claimed the open ground and turned it into legend. One wore a bucket and declared himself a knight. Another sacrificed a pepper in the name of dragonfire and paid for it with tears and applause. An old woman raised her hands in blessing, or possibly encouragement, and no one dared clarify which. Near the edge of it all, the priest squinted at the chaos, as though trying to remember whether he had approved this in a previous life. When someone assured him that he had, he accepted it with a nod and lifted his arms. The cheer that followed had nothing to do with theology. It was for me. Standing proudly, with a stolen hat tilted at an angle that suggested leadership, banners appeared as if summoned by belief alone. Sheets became symbols. Embroidery migrated from respectable clothing to public display. Hung high, they convinced even the doubtful that something official was underway. Dancing followed. Some of it was intentional. Much of it was gravity asserting itself. The reeve entered the fray with a confidence that ignored witnesses, flailing in a pattern he insisted belonged to an ancient harvest rite. People gave him room and kindness in equal measure. Food arrived bravely and fell apart under inspection. One pie collapsed into beans. Another offered flavors best left unnamed. Everyone chewed with dignity and smiled at nothing in particular. Ale arrived too soon and stayed too long. By midday, a blacksmith sang to a pig as though it were a trusted companion. The pig listened, which only encouraged him. Arguments sparked, fizzled, and resolved themselves through shared drunken wisdom. The question of whether the day was real ceased to matter. I climbed the hay cart when the crowd needed a speaker. From that height, everything looked like approval. I spoke in the language I knew. No one understood a word, yet the applause was thunderous. Later, I fell off the cart, and the moment passed into legend. Afternoon softened the square. Bodies settled where they stood. Paper crowns bent and surrendered. Instruments broke quietly. Honey cakes circulated with enthusiasm and consequences. The priest and the baker shared a jug and a question neither expected an answer to. They agreed that joy, however it arrived, was reason enough. Night came gently. Torches wavered. Songs lost their footing. No one remembered the bell. No one claimed credit. But the village slept with the satisfaction of having honored something unnamed and therefore untouchable. Beyond the last fence, the meadow waited. I watched the people whisper after supper, the way secrets moved faster when no one admitted starting them. Pairs drifted toward the grass and moonlight, carrying words too fragile for daylight. No one announced who would go. No one needed to. From where I stood, the village exhaled. The fires dimmed. Dogs abandoned their posts. And out there, Beyond the leaning fence, something important began the way it always did. Quietly. Together. Without asking permission. The meadow did not belong to the village during the day. It waited for night. Flat, wide, soaked in moonlight. It was the one place where words too fragile for daylight were allowed to exist without explanation. Confessions lived there. Regrets. Ridiculous plans that only sounded reasonable when whispered. The moon hung low and shameless above the trees, swollen and attentive, as if it had come specifically to observe poor decisions. Crickets filled the air with a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like commentary. The grass smelled of damp earth, crushed stems, and nervous anticipation. Marigold arrived first. She always did, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she needed the time. Her hair was braided so tightly it betrayed the hours she had spent on it. Each pull of the braid, a quiet rehearsal for composure. She stood near the old oak and pretended to admire the view, counting her breaths instead. Under her sleeve, pressed warm against her wrist, was a small, wilted posy. It was not fresh by accident. It had been chosen like that. Something preserved, something hopeful but cautious. Tom came next. His boots were muddy, his shirt was clean. That alone meant trouble. He paced in short, uneven lines, 3 steps one way, 2 back, as if the ground itself might offer guidance if he moved correctly. The moon watched him. So did Marigold. Neither said a word. Behind the blackberry bushes, Elsie and Marta crouched like conspirators. Their whispers darted back and forth, sharp and excited. "He's going to ask her tonight." "No, he isn't," he told Joran. Joran lies. He was crying when he said it. Could be allergies. They paused to observe a pair stumbling over the hill, hands clasped awkwardly, undecided whether the gesture was romance or negotiation. Near the riverbank, someone sang badly and with conviction. Another voice hissed for silence. A third clapped anyway, loyal to the attempt. The meadow filled with motion and possibility, each corner hosting its own near disaster. The first proposal happened quietly. A boy knelt in a puddle without realizing it, holding out a bent ring and a sentence that shook halfway through. He admitted he had nothing, but suggested maybe they could have nothing together. The girls stared, blinked once, then kissed him hard enough to startle an owl from a nearby branch. He forgot how knees worked. She forgot how lungs did. Elsewhere, another attempt unraveled mid-sentence. Words tripped over each other. Promises arrived unfinished. When goats were mentioned, the answer became immediate and absolute. The moon did not intervene. It never did. It simply observed. Under its watch, almost lovers drifted through the grass in clumsy orbits. Hands brushed and retreated. Secrets escaped before being reconsidered. Someone cried beside a fallen log. Someone else laughed too loudly and apologized for it. Twine bracelets changed hands. At least 2 futures were agreed upon in principle, one with conditions, one sealed with a pinky swear and a spit handshake that no one would ever fully admit to later. Not everyone was chosen. Lena waited beneath the hawthorn tree longer than she should have. The note in her sleeve grew warm from her grip. When it became clear no one was coming, she burned it with a flint, watching the words disappear before they could humiliate her. She walked home barefoot, wiping her eyes as if they were simply adjusting to the light. Gareth proposed to the wrong girl. Cloaks blurred together in the dark. When the mistake became obvious, she laughed until tears came. He followed shortly after. They agreed, sincerely, to forget the entire thing. 2 boys stood side by side in silence long enough for it to become meaningful. One eventually wished the other good night. Both stayed 5 more minutes, just in case. Behind the old millstone, someone who should not have been there at all kissed someone they definitely should not have kissed. One whispered that it was a terrible mistake. The other replied that it felt like the best one yet. Nearby, a goat stood wearing a garland, as if accidentally included in the future. By the time the stars thinned and the sky began to pale, the meadow looked worked over. Ribbons lay abandoned. Shoes had been forgotten. A crushed flower crown rested in the grass like evidence. The kind of mess left when too many hearts had been opened without instructions. Some couples walked home in silence, fingers brushing now and then, not ready for more, but unwilling to retreat. One boy ran, not toward anything, just away from something he had said and could not take back. And beneath the oak, Marigold remained. Tom never crossed the distance. She waited until the light shifted from silver to gray. Then she placed the posy at the base of the tree, turned away, and walked home alone. Her dignity held until she tripped once on a root. Only once. The meadow absorbed it all. By morning, it would say nothing. By morning, she would tell herself the stumble had meant nothing. No one would mention it outright, but glances would linger longer than necessary, and smiles would carry extra weight, the kind that suggested shared memory without consent. Two people would carefully avoid one another for a week, choosing different paths past the well and the bakehouse, until the awkwardness either thinned into forgetfulness or thickened into something worse, something with a name. Midnight had treated some kindly and others without mercy, but it had been honest. And in the year of our Lord, honesty under the moon came as close to magic as most villagers ever experienced. Quiet magic that rearranged lives without leaving proof. Evening vespers began with the familiar smells of wax and wet wool, the priest clearing his throat exactly twice, the precise number that signaled readiness, and the villagers arranging themselves in practice formation, solemn, slightly damp, and doing their best not to sneeze. Cloaks were adjusted, hands were folded. Each person settled into a place learned through repetition rather than instruction. Candles flickered with visible effort, rain tapped patiently on the roof, and the choir boys hummed the pre-hymn hum, unofficial yet sacred through habit, passed down simply because no one remembered when it had started. Then the chicken arrived. It slipped through the open side door without apology, left ajar by a latecomer who would later deny everything with impressive conviction. At first, no one noticed. It moved with the careful confidence usually reserved for sinners and tax collectors, a modest brown creature with sharp eyes and an unsettling sense of purpose, as if it had somewhere important to be. It made it halfway down the aisle before the first whisper surfaced. The blacksmith's daughter saw it and breathed the words as if naming it might summon lightning. Her brother shushed her, then pointed. The priest froze mid-sentence, halfway through a promise about sorrow and harvest, when the sound cut clean through the chapel. Cluck! It echoed far more loudly than it deserved, bouncing off stone and expectation alike. The congregation, well trained in the art of ignoring inappropriate developments in sacred spaces, remained perfectly still. Eyes stayed forward. Hands did not move. Everyone except the chicken, which had now hopped near the altar and was pecking at a forgotten drip of wax with professional interest. The priest closed his book and asked if anyone had brought it, his voice careful. The silence answered no, and also suggested they all agreed to pretend this was not happening, a decision reached instantly and without discussion. Then the chicken flapped. Feathers burst into the air, and the creature launched itself with impressive timing into the lap of old Hilda, who had not been sat upon by anything living in more than 30 years. Her startled yelp turned into a cough, then into a muttered phrase that technically qualified as blasphemy and successfully woke the sleepers in the back pew. The chapel unraveled in stages. Children shrieked with delight. Men ducked on instinct. Someone hurled a hymnal in the general direction of the problem, not to strike it, but to suggest divine intervention might occur nearby if encouraged. The priest attempted a prayer and instead pleaded aloud for deliverance from clucking, his words losing shape under pressure. The chicken leapt again, landed on the pulpit, and surveyed the room like a visiting dignitary from a questionable province. It pecked once, firmly. The apothecary muttered that it was not a holy bird. The priest, now sweating, raised his arms and declared the work of the devil. A child pointed and supplied a name, Margaret. The name settled instantly, unquestioned and irreversible, carried on relief and laughter. Margaret strutted to the edge of the pulpit, clucked with authority, and headed for the baptismal font. Someone announced she was going for the water. Someone else suggested redemption with surprising sincerity. At that point, the chapel divided neatly into three groups: those attempting capture with growing desperation, those failing to suppress laughter and no longer trying, and those who had decided this was simply part of the service and began humming again. A little louder now. The priest chased Margaret with a ceremonial candle, shouting about unclean spirits and poultry in sacred places. The candle went out at precisely the wrong moment. Margaret escaped. The baker's wife tried her shawl. The shawl tore with a sound like surrender. Margaret escaped again. The children cheered with the enthusiasm of witnesses to history. It was the youngest choir boy, small and largely ignored, who ended it without drama. He crouched, held out a piece of bread, and waited with the patience of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Margaret approached cautiously, accepted the offering, and allowed herself to be lifted. He held her with reverence and triumph. Feathers pressed against his chest, as if carrying a relic newly discovered. The congregation applauded before anyone remembered whether that was allowed, and the sound rose into the rafters where it lingered, long enough to be remembered later as something almost sacred. The applause faded slowly, like laughter embarrassed by daylight. The priest cleared his throat and attempted to reclaim the evening. "Ahem. Let us return to prayer," he said, smoothing his robes with renewed dignity, as though composure were something that could be buttoned back into place. Margaret was carried out with careful ceremony, cradled as if she were a visiting saint being politely escorted out of town rather than a chicken exiled for theological reasons. Evening prayers resumed, shakier than before. Every few minutes, someone stifled a giggle. The blacksmith's wife wiped tears from her cheeks. The reeve muttered that he had seen a sign. The priest made a point of not noticing the feather still drifting gently near the altar. After the final amen, the congregation filed out quietly, each person behaving as though nothing unusual had occurred. "She's our chicken now," one declared with authority. "She's chosen." They debated her title in urgent tones, Margaret the Holy or Margaret the Terrible, and agreed on only one thing, that she should live in the shed behind the chapel and be fed every Wednesday. No one asked the priest's permission. That night the village slept with the amused satisfaction of people who had witnessed something ridiculous and faintly divine. The stars hung overhead like scattered candlelight, and behind the chapel Margaret settled into a nest of straw, unaware that she had achieved accidental sainthood. In the village's memory, long after the candles burned low and the hymnals were repaired, the night would be remembered simply as the time Margaret invaded the chapel and everything became, somehow, a little more holy. When the last chores were finished and the wind curled its fingers through the thatched rooftops, people began to gather, not by invitation, never anything so formal, but by instinct. One by one, they drifted toward the great hall beside the tavern, drawn by the steady hearth and benches just soft enough to endure for an hour or two. Firelight danced across soot-darkened stone, shadows stretching and shrinking until they looked like giants one moment and chickens the next. The air smelled of smoke, damp wool, old onions, and the faintest trace of soup. A pot bubbled over the fire, claiming to be supper, though it was mostly memories, and a single carrot floating bravely at the surface. Children curled into corners with crusts of bread, pretending not to fall asleep. Elders leaned on their elbows. Middle-aged men stretched their legs with theatrical comfort while quietly rubbing their knees. Women passed around a cloth of boiled chestnuts and placed discreet bets on how long it would take before someone mentioned dragons. The stories began the way they always did, with Tolan, the miller's cousin. No one was entirely sure what he did, somewhere between brewing, borrowing, and bothering, but he had a voice like gravel and a deep affection for exaggeration. "Did I ever tell you about the time I met the ghost in the barley fields?" Groans answered him, mixed with grins. "Yes," shouted the children. "No," shouted Tolan, ignoring them. "That was my brother. This was the older ghost, meaner, drunker, smelled like turnips." The tales spiraled quickly, barley whispering secrets, a one-booted ghost whistling at sheep, a chase that ended with Tolan locked in a grain bin overnight. "You just passed out in there," someone muttered. "Semantics," he replied. Ma followed, claiming she once knew a man who wrestled a bear for love. No one believed her, especially after the bear turned out to be an unusually large dog, and the romance ended with a broken fence and 2 missing teeth. Still, she told it beautifully, her voice rising and falling like a fiddle tune, turning nonsense into something almost noble. Then came Wilfred, who always told the same story about a chicken that laid a perfectly square egg. The details shifted each time. Tonight, the chicken was named Judith, and the egg had been mistaken for a die and used in a game that ended a marriage. Between stories, mugs clinked, logs shifted, and sparks leapt from the fire as if eager to escape. The room grew quieter when old Bram finally spoke. He rarely did. Missing 2 fingers and most of his patience, he leaned forward and cleared his throat once. The hall waited, fingers and all of his patience. But he told stories like he had bottled time itself and learned how to pour it slowly. "This one's true," he said, which was how everyone knew it absolutely was not. He spoke of a knight who owned no horse, only a fiercely determined goat named Cyril, a creature with prophetic eyes and a fondness for chewing things that mattered. The knight attempted to ride Cyril into battle, or at least toward it, and the goat responded by eating part of his armor with focused enthusiasm. They never made it past the village gate, but Bram shaped the failure into a tale of destiny, betrayal, and goat-based prophecy so convincing it felt irresponsible not to believe it. By the end, people wiped tears from their eyes, some from laughter, others from pure confusion, and the fire snapped louder, as if it too were enjoying itself. Children slipped into sleep where they sat, heads sinking into laps, breaths evening out. One boy dreamed with his eyes open, staring into the flames as if expecting them to answer back. Outside, the wind howled once and then stopped, a reminder that the world beyond the hearth was wide, cold, and unimpressed. Inside, the walls held firm and the laughter lingered. Rhea followed with a story about a man who sneezed so violently it dislodged a tooth and altered the outcome of a local election. Someone added a tale of a woman who claimed to hear bees in her bread, which turned out to be true, and the loaf had to be exercised daily until it calmed down. Another voice swore they once saw a duck walk into the tavern, quack 3 times, and leave. Was it a real duck? Define real. The stories bled into one another like watercolors left in the rain, impossible to separate truth from jest or memory from invention, and no one tried. Stories were not for record keeping. They were for warmth, for distraction, for stretching a single evening into something that felt longer, fuller, and less ordinary. Eventually, yawns arrived in waves. Boots scraped stone. Cloaks were pulled tight. One by one, people stood, nodded good nights, and slipped back into the dark. Only the fire stayed awake, low and glowing, whispering to the last embers about goats and ghosts and the strange things people believed once stew had been shared. Night settled reluctantly over the village. The last traces of daylight slid behind the hills. Shutters creaked closed, candles were pinched out, and people climbed into beds that could generously be described as wooden excuses for comfort. Inside the cottages, the world shrank. Daytime noise faded into the rustle of straw-stuffed blankets, the soft clink of chamber pot lids, and the heavy sighs of bodies surrendering to sleep or arguing with it. Peace did not arrive quietly. Snoring began almost at once, not gentle or polite, but full-throated and furniture rattling, the sort of sound that suggested an ongoing wrestling match with one's own throat. It started, as always, in the blacksmith's hut, and was answered 3 doors down by a higher-pitched reply, like a duet no one had rehearsed. A dog whimpered in its dreams. A baby coughed once and reconsidered waking. The wind tapped a loose shutter. Somewhere a voice muttered, "Turn over, you old donkey," and received a grunt in response, followed by a loud, wet sound that required no translation. Flatulence held no shame in this village. It was considered a sign of health, vigor, and occasionally triumph. The baker's wife once claimed her husband frightened the rats out of the grain store with a single heroic effort. Whether that was true or not, the rats were gone, and the baker remained proud. Tonight the gas was particularly sociable. A rhythmic series echoed from Toland's cottage, followed by muffled laughter as he and his wife whispered guesses about what animal each sound resembled. That one was a goose, she decided. In another hut, 2 teenage boys lay at opposite ends of a lumpy mattress, giggling helplessly. "Did you hear that?" "No, that was you." They dissolved again, smothering the noise with pillows that smelled faintly of old hay and secrets. Outside, the village breathed as one, ridiculous, alive, and entirely unaware that in the quiet rhythm of snores and shared air, it was holding together just fine. Had once been sacks of grain, and through it all, the fleas held court. They were the true insomniacs of the village, tiny tyrants ruling the mattress realm without mercy. The moment human skin touched straw, they surged into action like opening night at the theater. Bites landed with professional accuracy. Itches bloomed like unwanted flowers. People scratched in their sleep. Some groaned. One woman, half awake, slapped her leg and whispered, "Got you, you little demon," before rolling over in triumph. The apothecary swore by a flea-repelling salve made from garlic, mint, and hopeless optimism. It worked for exactly 1 night. The second night, the fleas returned with what could only be described as reinforcements. Dreams slipped loose, strange and untrustworthy. The blacksmith dreamed of a dancing cow that judged him with deep disappointment. A young girl imagined her chicken could speak and accused her of theft. The reeve, noble even in sleep, muttered official phrases about fences and cabbage law, all of which he would deny by morning. In the manor house, the steward snored so rhythmically it was mistaken for distant drumming. The housemaid dreamed of a feast where every spoon had legs, and fled just before the soup was served. In a small cottage, a widow dreamed of her husband, not as he had been, but as she wished he had been, quieter, gentler, smelling of rosemary, able to dance without stepping on toes. Down in the common house, the last fire sputtered and sighed. One man sat upright in his sleep, eyes fluttering, muttering about taxes and trousers until his bunkmate nudged him flat again. Even the animals joined the chorus. A pig snorted in its pen, chasing something invisible. Perhaps a runaway apple, perhaps a grudge. The goats murmured softly, and one sneezed with such force it startled the other into knocking over a bucket. The night deepened. Stars blinked, distant and unimpressed. The moon slid across the sky, peering through thin windows, lighting crooked noses and open mouths, tattered quilts and dangling feet. The wind sang its own lullaby through the trees. A barn door creaked. A frog chirped once, reconsidered, and returned to doing nothing. Sleep held the village, not gently, not kindly, but effectively. Despite the snores and the farts, the scratching and muttering, the people slept because this was life. Loud, itchy, mildly humiliating. And tomorrow would arrive soon with roosters, burnt porridge, and someone pretending they had not spoken in their sleep about marrying a goat. For now, the village breathed, huffed, snored, and shuffled beneath the patchy quilt of night. In the darkness, a single flea paused, wiped its tiny face, and returned to work. Most fires had gone out by then. Only thin ribbons of smoke curled from a few chimneys, drifting upward into the star-choked sky like final sighs. The village quieted, not silent, never that, but hushed, as if the earth itself had pulled up a woolen blanket and settled in. Still, there was always one last task. Tomlin pulled on his boots by feel rather than sight. They were still damp from the stream, and one held a stubborn piece of straw, but he did not complain. He lifted the lantern with a soft grunt, its light dim but steady, and stepped into the cool breath of night. From the bed his wife mumbled something that might have been, "Don't forget the latch," or possibly turnip soup. He nodded anyway. Outside, the ground felt soft and forgiving, holding the day's warmth deep in its belly. He passed the lean-to, the rain barrel, the patch of weeds that had resisted 3 seasons of insults. The barn loomed ahead, more shadow than structure, its roof sagging like an old man bowing to the moon. He pushed the door open with a creak that sounded far too loud, as if the wood itself resented being disturbed so late. Inside, the barn lived the way barns always did at night. Straw shifted, hooves adjusted, breath moved through darkness like a slow tide. The smell met him, strong, familiar, oddly comforting. Hay, animal, old wood, and time. He lifted the lantern slightly and stepped in, unaware that even here, in the quiet between heartbeats, the village was still telling stories. Where ordinary nights become sacred small lives, quiet miracles.